Hey class, good afternoon and welcome back to Psychology of Adjustment. We are moving from chapter 2 into chapter 3, and this chapter is about stress and the effect it has on our bodies, our minds, and some ways in which we might want to try to cope with stress. So I can't, I think of when we think about the subject of adjustment, adjusting to the world around us. Really what we're talking about is a big portion of what we're talking about is stress response and how do we adjust to the stress in our life, for example. So we're going to be looking at that sort of lens for this chapter, and we'll start by looking at the nature of stress. So you should be able to describe the experience of stress in everyday life. None of us are exempt from stress. We all experience stress to some degree. We'll talk about the different ways we appraise stress, primary versus secondary, and look at the role of different kinds of stress, including ambient, ethnicity related stress, and acculturation stress. So some different kind of lenses by which, because not all stress is equal and doesn't come in the same shapes and sizes. It comes in all kinds of sizes and affects people differently. So that's what we're going to look at. So stress is just, straight out of our textbook, our adjustment textbook. It is any circumstances that are perceived to be threatening towards your well-being, and you're thereby taxing your ability to cope. So it becomes, when we perceive an event to be stressful to our well-being, and then also thinking, okay, not only is it stressful, but do I actually have the resources to cope with the stressor itself. So it is a complex concept, to say the least. We experience stress every single day of our lives. Otherwise, without stress, we wouldn't get out of bed. We wouldn't do the things we need to do. And stress comes in all shapes and sizes. There are things we encounter every single day that can be stressful, some minor, some major. Even those things that may themselves not necessarily be stressful by themselves, but kind of those daily hassles can have a pretty negative impact on your well-being. Like, sitting in traffic one day to get home, from work is probably not that big of a deal. But if you have to sit in traffic, really bad traffic every single day, those kind of everyday hassles can eventually, have a pretty profound impact on your well-being negatively. And then stress can also have an accumulative or additive impact, meaning it can accumulate over time, kind of like those everyday hassles, or be more additive. If all of a sudden, a big life change comes, a big stressful life change happens, like, for example, like if you lost a loved one, or or your relationship with somebody ended, for example, that would have more of an additive impact. It's adding more stress rather than kind of accumulating it over time. It might just be all in once. Stress is a very subjective experience. It's not only complex, but it's also subjective. Like, some people will experience the same events and be very stressed out, while others are not, so there's very much the subjective psychological element to stress. And it ultimately comes down to how we appraise certain events. So we have our primary appraisal, which is whether or not we appraise the event to be stressful or not. So if for example, if you walk into class today and your professor says, hey, we have a pop quiz today, some of your classmates might be so prepared that they are appraised the situation as it's not stressful. Others, maybe they're behind, maybe they didn't get a chance to do the reading they were supposed to, and now they're appraising the situation to be very stressful. And then if we view the situation as stressful, we have a secondary appraisal, basically determining what is our ability to cope with this situation. Like, not only is it stressful, but do I have the resources to cope? And so this is what it might look like. You encounter an event, a stimulus, something that evokes stress. Your primary appraisal can be, okay, this is relevant and it is threatening to my well-being. Or you could go down the path of, hey, it's harmless, it's not a big deal. And if you go down that latter path, you're more likely to experience no stress. But if you realize, oh, this is relevant and threatening, you move on to kind of the second phase, the second step of appraisal, realizing, do I have the resources or not? And if you don't have the resources, you're more likely to experience stress. If you do have the resources to adequately cope, you're probably not going to experience much stress, or any stress for that matter. Stress is also embedded into our environment. We encounter stress from the moment we wake up to the moment we go to bed. And you can probably find stress around every single corner if you really look for it. So there are different kinds of stress. We have ambient stress. This is really talking about chronic stress that is embedded into the environment. So for example, people who live in poverty, being exposed to excessive noise, traffic pollution, crowding, violence, things like that. Those are ambient stresses that are kind of built into the environment. And we do see, for example, people who live in poverty are much more likely to demonstrate elevated levels of stress hormones, which in the short term are fine. We do need to, when we encounter stressors, those stress hormones are helpful, but when we are chronically exposed to those hormones, that can be actually detrimental to your physical health. It is influenced by our culture. Essentially, cultures kind of set the expectation or the context by which we appraise stress, like determining which events are stressful and which are not. And we do see, for example, there are disparities, there are variations in terms of different groups, different cultural groups will experience stressors that others do not. For example, if you belong to different racial ethnicities, you might be more prone, racial and ethnic groups might be more prone, for example, to discrimination, prejudice, discrimination, things like that, which can have a profound negative impact on your mental health and well-being. Immigrants, whether they're coming here, whatever reason they're coming here, refugee status, legal immigration, illegal immigration, for example, that is a stressful, that change from your culture to another, this process of acculturation where you're asked to adapt to a new culture can be a powerful stressor. Even if it's obviously it's a positive, it could be a positive change. Like maybe you're, starting a new life and you want new opportunities and things like that. And that's a big deal. But it can still lead to quite a bit of stress that's kind of embedded into the culture as you're moving. And so, for example, like American culture in this picture here, a lot of the stress is kind of built into our culture of loving cars and having the freedom of the open road, but really not right here. It's not so open in this picture. Okay, so what are the sources of stress? So we're going to, in this section, we're going to distinguish between acute, chronic, and anticipatory stressors, describe frustration and internal conflict and how they relate to stress, and then summarize the research in terms of life changes and pressure on stress in the modern life. So 3 kind of categories of stressors. We have acute stressors. These may pop up quickly and disappear. Like they are threatening events, but they don't last very long. And there is a clear endpoint. Like, for example, maybe on your calendar, you have a test coming up and that's stressing you out. But once you take the test, it's, it's off your plate. You don't have to necessarily stress about it too much. Maybe you stress about, getting your grade back, I guess, but once you get the test off your plate, get your grade back, ideally you would think that stressor might end. Chronic stressors, these are ones that don't necessarily have a time limit and they're happening again and again and again. So for example, like if you're somebody who has to drive through like really dense traffic every day to get to and from work, that might be an example of a chronic stressor that, there's no end in sight, meaning it's not like tomorrow, all of a sudden traffic is just going to like cease to exist. And then you have anticipatory stressors, which, things that you kind of anticipate coming up, for example, kind of going back to that test, if you have a big test or a big assignment in your coursework or at your job, coming up, that future event, especially if you perceive it to be threatening, can definitely lead to some stress. And just imagining the stressor can actually lead to some of those, psychologically and physiologically stress responses the same way as if the stress is here. So just imagining the stressor can actually evoke the stress response. Other things that might lead to stress or kind of have a strong relationship to stress is frustration. Basically, anytime you feel like you are not able to achieve the goals that you want to set out for yourself, that can lead to more stress. We also have internal conflict. Basically, when maybe we're juggling 2 options that aren't necessarily compatible. Making a big choice in your life, should I go to this school? Should I go to that school? Any kind of conflict that might come up, big life things that are maybe, existential conflict that maybe you're kind of personally dealing with, can also lead to stress. So how do we deal with these conflicts, or how do we deal with stress? They're depending on the stressor, we can approach stressors in different ways. We can use an approach method, which means really we're making the choice between two attractive choices or goals. Like, let's say you're picking a restaurant to eat tonight, and maybe you have like a favorite Italian restaurant, you have a favorite, Mexican restaurant, and whatever choice you're happy, you're going to one of your favorite restaurants. Avoidance is, when you have two unattractive goals. It's like being in a rock and a hard place. Either it's kind of that saying, damned if you do, damned if you don't. Maybe neither choice is attractive, but you gotta pick one. And then approach avoidance, you have to choose whether or not to pursue one goal, which has pros and cons. And of course, one of the cons might be, if I choose this, I avoid this whole other choice. So depending on the nature of the circumstances, choice also matters and comes into play when we're experiencing stress or coping with stress. So for example, approach, you might look at things to do on a date. Maybe we might go out to tennis, get pizza. I might wear my favorite blue sweater, or maybe I'll go to the movies, get spaghetti, and wear my favorite gray jacket. Like, they're positive things there. Avoidance, if you're at a job you don't like, well, you could quit or get fired, and leads to unemployment. Might also lead to painful backache, maybe the stress itself of that course. Maybe you decide you stick with it. It's a degrading job. You keep your insurance, and therefore you can have the surgery that you might need for your back if it's damaged or whatever. And then approach avoidance, if you're deciding whether or not to ask somebody out, it might be, well, the pros were, well, I can go on a date with this person I perceive to be attractive. Rejection could be, or the cons could be, well, there's a rejection. So different ways that could take place. Another area of stress, and one that might be a little surprising to hear, are life changes, even positive life changes. Negative and positive life changes can both be stressful. And there is a scale developed by Holmes and Ray that looks at the social readjustment rating scale to measure the level of stress that different changes in the lifespan across the lifespan might lead to. So for example, like if you lose the death of a spouse, like if you lost your husband, your wife, your partner, that is considered by most to be, one of the most stressful events you can have. Divorce, not far behind. But let's look at, marriage. Marriage is a positive event. Like you're creating a family, you're uniting two families, for example, but yet it ranks pretty high on stress. And, I can say from personal experience, I got married almost a year ago at the time of this recording. And while it was a wonderful event, and it was like one of if not the happiest days of my life, the planning of a wedding and marriage can be stressful. Navigating the dynamics of that new relationship can be stressful, even though it is obviously a very, very, positive event in most people's lives. It can still lead to stress. So negative events, negative and positive life changes can lead to stress. Another area of stress might be kind of that feeling of pressure. When people put expectations, sometimes we put those expectations and demand on ourselves. Sometimes other people put them on us. Like for example, if you have a job, maybe your boss has a task they want you to complete, or at school, maybe you have the pressure of turning in your assignments, things like that. So typically we talk about pressure in terms of the pressure to perform or the pressure to conform. So pressure to perform might be, turning in your work on time as a student. Pressure to conform might be, following certain expectations. So maybe when you're, new to a job, there's maybe that initial, pressure at first to kind of understand the culture and the nuances of your new job and conform to those expectations. And again, I mentioned earlier, pressure is also self-imposed. Sometimes we put deadlines on ourselves, got to get this done by a certain time. So how do we respond to stress is the next section. So you're going to learn about different ways we can respond and cope with stress. So you should be able to summarize research on typical emotional responses, both positive and negative, describe how we physiologically respond to stress, including fight or flight and the general adaptation syndrome. We'll talk about the two major pathways which the brain uses to send signals to the endocrine system. Remember, the brain is part of the nervous system. The endocrine system is part of your glands and all that important stuff. Sorry, I just heard my Roomba go off. I heard a noise in the background, and it took me a second to figure out what's going on. It's not my dog, but it's definitely the Roomba. And then we'll talk about the concept of coping, of dealing with stress. So stress itself is complex and multidimensional, so it only makes sense that our responses to stress are complex and multidimensional. So we might respond to stress at different levels simultaneously or at different times, emotionally, physiologically, and behaviorally. So coping kind of involves 1, 2, or 3 of these different responses. So when we talk about emotional responses, first of all, we need to define what emotions are. These are feelings that are accompanied by physiological changes. For the most part, they're uncontrollable. Like, if you see something that makes you upset or see something that makes you happy, for the most part, it's, you don't have a ton of control over that response itself. I mean, obviously you can control, your exposure to things that make you happy or make you sad, but typically speaking, those are just physiological responses. We are trained to respond a certain way emotionally, culturally, and otherwise. Some negative emotional response to stress might be annoyance, anger, rage, apprehension, anxiety, fear, dejection, sadness, and grief. And these, of course, these different emotions will have a huge impact on the behaviors you use to engage to relieve stress. So the emotions can actually feed into the behavioral responses as well. Negative emotions are typically expected in response to stressful events. Like if all of a sudden you went out to check the mail and all of a sudden you found out, oh my gosh, I have a ticket. I got caught, running a traffic light. I didn't realize it, and a ticket just showed up. You'd probably be pretty mad, be like, oh my God, I didn't realize it, or something like that. Any kind of negative event might be something we might appraise and demonstrate negative emotions. And our ability to actually talk about those stressful events and the negative emotions that accompany it can actually be the difference between experiencing severe reactions to stress. Like if you can verbalize it and vocalize it to other people, it kind of draws some of the power away from the stressor. And also, some of that social affiliation definitely helps too, to kind of put things into perspective. So negative emotions, definitely, that's one way we deal with stress. So for example, when we lose a loved one, like I don't know definitively that's what's happening in this picture here, but it looks like maybe this is a response to a loss or tragedy. We let out those very real powerful emotions. So stress can also prompt positive emotional responses. It's not just negative. We might, experience gratitude. We might experience renewed love. Excuse me, I'm going to close my door just in case the Roomba decides it wants to poke in and clean my office. So my apologies. But sometimes stress, kind of puts things into perspective. If we experience loss, which can be stressful, maybe that leads to us feeling more grateful for the things that we still have and the loved ones we have. Positive emotions also contribute to building more bonds and resources that help us deal with stress. And, the experience of positive emotions is part of that, flourishing mental health. It's a good sign of good mental health. And you can read some really interesting research about how we express our emotions, no smile, partial smile, big smile, and how that really leads to average life expectancy. But needless to say, positive emotions is good for reducing stress. It's good for longevity, all of those things. So take a look at that. How do we respond to stress? Strong emotions, positive or negative, can actually get in the way or perhaps enhance our ability to cope with stress. It really depends on where we're at in terms of our arousal. There's kind of this Yerkes-Dodson curve. It's called inverted U. And it really shows that depending on the nature of the task, we need a certain amount of stress. So for example, if a task is pretty low in terms of its complexity, that means it's going to be easy to get bored with. So we kind of want a higher level of arousal to kind of keep us engaged. If the task is more medium in terms of its complexity, we want to be somewhere in the middle. If the task is very complex, if it's higher in its complexity, we don't want a lot of stress. We don't want a lot of arousal. And this is kind of what that might look like in terms of this inverted U. So depending on the nature of the task, each one of us has a certain amount of arousal or stress that we can sort of endure, to cope with the stress. How do we respond physiologically? Well, we go into fight or flight. When we encounter a situation that is perceived as threatening, our body, through the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system regulated by the autonomic nervous system, regulates the experience of fight or flight, where the body is mobilizing resources either to fight the stressor or potentially flee. And this is so incredibly important for our ability to survive as a species. Like back in the day, hundreds of thousands of years ago, if you saw let's say a lion on the plains of Savannah when we were still hunters and gatherers, that might send you into the appropriate fight or flight response of, hey, I either need to fight this thing off so I can live, or I need to get the heck out of there so I can live. Nowadays, our fight or flight, our autonomic nervous system goes off at any perceived stressor. Like right now, if you're in my adjustment class and I said, hey, guess what? We have a test tomorrow. And if you're not prepared for that, your body might go through that same fight or flight response as if you are, being chased by a large apex predator. The brain doesn't make the distinction. The body doesn't make the distinction. It's a stressor, it just interprets as that stress. So the sympathetic is what mobilizes those resources and allows us to cope with stressors. We use the parasympathetic nervous system to calm the body down. So sympathetic is fight or flight. Parasympathetic is rest and digest, or tend and befriend is another way of thinking about it, as in terms of like dealing with stress. And we tend to see that tend and befriend response is more typical for females than males. A lot of it has to do with culture. It's, the way males are, the culture in society, the way we think about how males should behave and how females should. It's not like just being a female causes you. There's a lot more to it than that, but we tend to see that kind of response more so with women. And here is what it looks like, when you're going through fight or flight, sympathetic nervous system, your pupils dilate, you get the goosebumps all of your skin, your heart rate increases. And basically when you calm down, when you go into rest and digest, or the parasympathetic nervous system, everything is reversed. Your pupils constrict, there's no more goosebumps, your heart rate decreases, digestion resumes, all of those things. Hans Celia looked at stress in another way. He modeled how the body actually responds to stressful situations, and he called it the general adaptation syndrome. And there are 3 stages. The alarm, this is when, and this is in terms of like mobilizing resources specifically for your immunoresponse, your immune system. So you will, the alarm reaction, the alarm stage is when you recognize the stress, and this is when you initially go into fight or flight. Once you're in that mode, stage 2, this is when you mobilize the resources and resist the stressor. When you start to cope with the stressor, and ideally it stops here. If you adequately cope with the stress or remove the stress, stops here. But if you continue to linger, if the stress does not, if the threat or the stressor continues, the body's resources become depleted in the exhaustion stage. And this is where you're more likely to physically become exhausted, and also opens you up more for illness. You have depleted your immune system's ability to fight off potential stressors. And this is when stress can actually be bad for our physical health. So this is what this might look like, physically. Alarm phase, resources are highest in the 2nd stage, but by stage 3, if the stressor isn't gone, those resources, our ability to resist, starts to plummet. And this is all being regulated also by, the nervous system, but also the endocrine system, those glands that are, spread throughout the body that secrete hormones into our bloodstream. This regulates our experience of stress, the physiological response with stress, along with the brain-body pathways that we use, via the hypothalamus. So not only are you receiving signals from the endocrine, but you're also receiving signals from the nervous system, and the two are kind of working together to form this stress response. So the first pathway is through the autonomic nervous system, activating those adrenal glands and releasing catecholamines. And this is what mobilizes those initial resources. The second pathway tends to be slower. It's from the brain to the endocrine system through the pituitary gland, which stimulates the adrenal glands, which releases corticosteroids, increases energy. And in short doses, this stuff is fine. We need it to deal with stress. But chronic stress, when we stay here for too long and chronically, that's when it becomes detrimental to our health. So here is kind of visually what this might look like. You have stress, and we have these 2 different pathways. One is regulated through the brain, the autonomic nervous system, the other more so through the adrenal glands. Stress, I mentioned this earlier, stress can reduce immune response. Like people are more susceptible to colds and everyday sickness when you're stressed, when you're chronically stressed. It can also interfere with your brain's ability to form new neurons. We call this neurogenesis. Stress has so many detrimental impacts on the body, physiologically speaking. So we've talked about the affective, we've talked about the physiological response to stress. We can also respond to stress by changing our behaviors. This is referred to as coping, where we can either master or reduce or learn to tolerate the demands that are created by stress. Coping comes in all shapes and sizes, just like stress itself. There are healthy ways of coping, and there are unhealthy ways of coping. So, for example, a healthy way of coping is maybe asking for help. Like if you're stressed about something, and you go to a friend and ask for help. Unhealthy would be, okay, I'm really stressed out. I'm going to go buy a bottle of vodka tonight and just going to drink my problems away, or I'm going to eat a lot, or something like that. You're definitely, you're treating the emotions. You're not actually dealing with the stress itself. So the coping strategies we use determine whether or not the stress has a negative effect or a positive effect on us physically, mentally, emotionally. Okay, so what are the effects of stress? So now we've talked about where stress comes from. How do we cope with it? What are the effects? So we'll explain you should be able to explain the influence of stress on task performance, cognitive functioning, and eventually leading to burnout, assess the potential impact of stress on health, both mental and physical health, and articulate at least two ways in which stress might lead to beneficial effects. Again, stress can be detrimental, but we do need some stress. We have to be stressed to some degree in order to function. We do know that stress can lead to impaired task performance. For example, when we feel pressure, it's more likely to disrupt our ability to focus and to attend. And there's even this idea that people literally will choke, not literally, I guess literally, people will sometimes even choke under pressure. Like, for example, in golf, you see, when a golfer is under tremendous pressure to sink a putt, some of the best golfers in the world are ones who can thrive under the pressure, and the ones who maybe aren't the best in the world, or maybe the ones who might quote unquote choke. We do see stress impairs cognitive functioning, our ability to think. It increases the likelihood that we'll jump to conclusions when we're trying to understand where stress is coming from. We're more likely to engage in unsystematic ways of reviewing our options to deal with stress. And memory just does not work the same. We just don't have as good of memory, cognitively speaking, when we're undergoing stress. Chronic stress can also lead to a syndrome called burnout. This is where you experience physical and emotional exhaustion from chronic stress. And typically we're talking about work-related stress, like getting burnt out at your job. And it has a lot of consequences, because burnout is one of the big reasons why people choose to leave their jobs or leave their field. So jobs that are associated with high levels of burnout, for example, have high turnover rates. So things that might precede or burnout, like antecedents, like being overworked, not having a lot of support, not having control or ability to make choices at your job, not being recognized for your effort. And those consequences of burnout can lead to more physical illness, greater turnover on the job, less commitment when you're on the job, and if you're working, even less productivity. So not only does the individual suffer from burnout, but organizations employing individuals who are burnt out also would suffer. Stress also has, a lot of negative impacts in terms of academic performance. Students who are chronically stressed probably aren't going to do as well academically. It also leads to impairments of our ability to sleep, get adequate sleep, lowers relationship satisfaction, increases sexual difficulties, erectile dysfunction, things like that. Correlates with substance abuse. Like some people will treat their stress via substances. And it also can contribute to the onset of various psychological disorders, depression, schizophrenia, anxiety, eating disorders, anything, maybe you remember from intro psych, or maybe some of your other psych courses. One specific psychological disorder that goes hand in hand with stress, obviously, is post-traumatic stress disorder, or PTSD. This is where an individual is experiencing a disturbance, that is directly related to the experience of a major traumatic event. And it does not have to be somebody who is, seeing combat. If you've been the victim of or witnessed a crime, if you've been involved in a natural disaster, if you've lost a loved one, I mean, things like that can lead to these traumatic responses. And a lot of times people with PTSD will talk about having symptoms where they're re-experiencing the trauma. They feel emotionally numb. They feel much more anxious, emotionally aroused. And, and this is happening for a recurrent period of time. It's not like a one-off thing. This is happening pretty consistently. It's also correlates pretty strongly with substance abuse, depression, anxiety, and also physical health problems. So there's a high comorbidity rate for PTSD and other disorders. However, most people who do experience trauma don't actually develop PTSD. So it's important to keep in mind. But really, a lot of it comes down to is the intensity of your reaction to the traumatic event. Again, some people appraise certain events to be very traumatic, very stressful, and others maybe not so much. So that can be a pretty strong predictor of what's going to happen in terms of the development of PTSD or not. Stress also goes hand in hand with physical illness. We see people who are more stressed are more likely to develop psychosomatic diseases, which are psychological factors like emotional distress leading to physical ailments, leading to impairments of the body, such as high blood pressure, ulcers, asthma, eczema, migraines, tension headaches, things like that. This is where your mental health is manifesting itself in the form of physical health. Stress can also have positive effects, which is kind of hard, kind of weird to say after all we just said about stress. It can sometimes lead to what's called post-traumatic growth. Like after undergoing a very stressful experience, if you come out on the other side, maybe a little bit better. I don't want to say it's not like the saying what doesn't kill you makes you stronger, because that's not, like a very positive approach to it. But, sometimes we can grow, we can endure certain events and grow from them. And it also, when we deal with stressful events, it kind of inoculates us a little bit to know how to cope with and prepare for future stressful events, especially ones that might be similar. Okay, we're getting close to wrapping this chapter up, but looking at factors that might influence our stress tolerance. Some people are more tolerant than others. And it comes down to things like how much social support you have, how hardy are you in your response? Do you adopt more of an optimistic versus pessimistic approach? And then we'll look at some research regarding how we can buffer stress using the power of hugs. Pretty cool stuff. So some people do withstand stress better than others. Like some people seem to have better responses to stress than others. It's not like they are superhumans. They might just have, access to maybe resources or ways of appraising the situation that might be different. But psychologists have identified a couple of factors that might play. Having good social support or lack thereof is a huge moderating variable in terms of whether or not we experience stress. Like people who have more social support, maybe they experience stress, but they have more resources perhaps to deal. Maybe they still deal with the same amount of stress, but they have more resources. They have more help, for example. And hardiness is kind of, it's this dispositional, attitudinal approach to how long we are willing to deal with a challenge. How much control do we feel like we have over a situation? And the more hardy individuals tend to be, the more strongly they tend to be able to resist stress. So, we experience a stressful event, we appraise the event to be stress, we have these different responses, but we also have moderating variables that will have a pretty profound impact on whether or not the stressful leads to positive outcomes or negative outcomes. Another factor that might play into your stress response is, are you more of an optimist or more of a pessimist? If you're more optimistic, you tend to expect good things. You tend to expect good outcomes. Optimists tend to engage in much more action-oriented, problem-focused coping rather than emotional. They're also more likely to seek social support. Pessimists tend to use more counterproductive methods for dealing with stress, like avoiding the stressors, giving up on it, maybe even denying that they're there. And typically we associate being optimistic with more, better mental and physical health outcomes. So some really cool research about how hugs can actually be used as social support. There was some really cool research you can read about by Cohen and colleagues from 2015, how they looked at the role that hugs can have, or receiving hugs can have on reducing stress. And they found that hugs can reduce the negative effects of stress, whether they were received in times of tension or not. There is that oxytocin, that cuddle hormone that gets released when we have physical contact with people, who are close to us. And that seems to have a really strong impact on reducing stress. Okay, I spoke too soon. This is the last section, sorry. Reducing stress through self-control. So you should be able to explain how behavior modification can be used to improve self-control and summarize the 5 steps in the process of self-modification. Sometimes, stress can come from our habits. Like we might engage in behavioral habits that lead to more stress. And so sometimes we might have to pick problematic behaviors and change those. And psychology really, this is a big thing for psychology, is modifying behaviors, replacing detrimental behaviors with more proactive ones. And the objective is to take something that is undesirable, replace it with something that is desirable. And it can be used in a wide variety of settings to treat a wide variety of problems. So the 5 steps really are: be specific about what target behavior you want. So for example, if you want to study more, if you decide, hey, I'm stressed about, schoolwork, so I want to make sure I have enough time to study and prepare. You want to be specific, hey, I'm going to study for 1 hour every single day, Monday through Friday. I'm being very specific about the behavior. And so maybe ahead of time, then you can gather baseline data. Maybe for a week, you track, okay, I'm going to measure how often I study. Looks like I'm only studying Monday night and Friday afternoon. Then you figure out, okay, well, if I want to increase my studying, I need to have some kind of program, maybe to increase the rate of studying. Then you run the program, evaluate it, see whether or not it was successful. If it was successful, you end your program. If not, maybe you revise it and start over. And this is what this might look like kind of visually, but you could pick any kind of target behavior, plug in what you want, and go from there. So for example, if you're trying to reduce, caloric intake, you might, so for example, specify your target behavior. I want to reduce my caloric intake. You might gather data for a week or 2. It looks like this one kept data for about 2 weeks on caloric intake. And then, maybe you implement a plan to reduce your caloric intake. Maybe you start off, hey, I'm going to reduce it by 100, this week or this month, and go from there. Okay, that's it for chapter 3. This is a chapter on stress. Hopefully it wasn't too stressful for you, but we'll be back soon for chapter 4. Be good and be safe.